Dan, Trent, and John for inviting me to speak. Before I begin, I just want to make two small apologies. One is that I started writing this paper and came up with this great title. And then as I wrote the paper, it turned out that I didn't fit in what I would like to say about glimpses. So I'm not going to be talking about glimpses today. So my title's a little bit misleading. And also, I think there are a lot of connections between divine hiddenness and faith, and I'm going to make one just very briefly in the middle of the paper, but that hasn't been fully developed either. So I hope to gather a lot of resources from all of the talks at this conference to maybe develop it a bit more. Okay, so the question, why doesn't God make himself more obvious, is pressing for many people. Even those who trust God's revelation are sometimes painfully aware that his revelation is partial. So anyone who has experienced periods of God's silence or felt absence, or who's had prayers go unanswered, are likely to resonate with the thought that God is hidden, even if only partially hidden. So I think what we see of God may be most like a glimpse. And that's the only occurrence of glimpse in this paper. Okay. But the way in which God is supposed to be hidden in the arguments under discussion in the hiddenness literature is a very different kind of hiddenness than this. So this kind of hiddenness is directly related to the evidence available for God's existence. And specifically, it refers to the poverty of our evidential situation with respect to God's existence. The existence of a perfectly loving God is allegedly inconsistent with, or in some sort of apparent tension with, God's existence. The existence of a perfectly loving God is inconsistent with the evidential situation in which we find ourselves. So some have claimed that the evidence is not enough to rationally believe that God exists, and that God, if he were loving, would have put us in a much stronger evidential situation or position than we are currently in. So my goal in this paper is to clarify this argument and to point to a couple ways in which the argument as currently present in the literature needs elucidation. And specifically, I want to challenge something that I think is usually assumed in the literature, which is that the following are inconsistent. God's making available adequate evidence for his existence, and the existence of non-culpable non-believers. So that's what I'm going to do first, and then in closing I'm going to offer a few arguments on a slightly different version of the argument, one which proceeds by way of higher order evidence. Okay, so first, the argument. Most of the arguments in the literature are offshoots of Schellenberg's central argument, and I'm going to be working with the following simplified reconstruction. It's a very simple argument. Premise 1, if a loving God exists, then there are no non-resistant non-believers. Premise 2, there are non-resistant non-believers. Conclusion, no loving God exists. Now, in this context, a non-resistant non-believer is usually thought to be someone who has inculpable non-belief. And this is characteristic of someone who lacks belief through no fault of their own. Inculpable non-belief is contrasted with culpable non-belief. Culpable non-believers resist the evidence in some way. And a problem arises due to the existence of non-resistant non-believers because it is thought that a loving God would provide or make available sufficient evidence of his existence to everyone who wants to believe. Okay, so that's the argument. And there are a variety of ways in which philosophers have responded to this argument. Some replies involve rejection of premise 2. That is, some deny that there are non-culpable non-believers. And this would be to claim that everyone who doesn't believe in God is resisting the evidence in some way. So it's something analogous to having their eyes closed. Other replies to the argument involve rejection of premise 1. And this strategy generally proceeds by offering some sort of reason God might have for permitting non-resistant non-belief. Now, I think this work... Is my mic not working?
I think it's not on.
Oh, did I not turn it on? Sorry.
Okay. I think... You're kidding. Okay. I think this work is important, but this talk isn't going to contribute to either of those goals. So instead, I want to advance a different route for rejecting premise 1. It's usually assumed that if non-resistant non-believers exist, it's because God has not provided or made available evidence sufficient for belief. Schellenberg claims that a non-resistant non-believer will always be, quote, in a position to participate in relationship, where in a position to relate personally to God is something along the lines of having it within one's power to do so just by choosing. So the idea here is that if God makes evidence of his existence available to these people, and they have their eyes open, then they'll be in a position to believe and relate to God.
Sorry, could you say premise 1 again?
Yes. Premise 1 is if there is a loving God, if a loving God exists, then there are no non-resistant non-believers. Premise 2, there are non-resistant non-believers. Okay, so I think premise 1 can be unpacked in the following 2 steps in this way. So this is 4 and then 5. 4, if God exists, then he provides or makes available adequate evidence of his existence. And 5, if God provides or makes available adequate evidence of his existence, then there are no non-resistant non-believers. And I'm going to argue that on some plausible understanding of provides adequate evidence, 5 is false. So I'll say 5 one more time. If God provides or makes available adequate evidence of his existence, then there are no non-resistant non-believers. So I want to suggest that non-culpable non-belief is compatible with God's providing or making available sufficient evidence for his existence. Okay. So 2 questions that naturally arise when we look at the suggestion that God has not provided adequate evidence are, what exactly is God obligated to do that he hasn't? And what's wrong with our evidential situation? And discussions in the literature on the problem of hiddenness, I think, are generally not very clear on what an answer to these 2 questions would look like. So here's a few statements from Schellenberg about what we'd expect a loving God to do. He says, quote, God would make conscious awareness of the divine available to every finite personal creature capable of experiencing it. This is from The Wisdom to Doubt. Humans would be given access to evidence sufficient for belief in God's existence. That's from Divine Hiddenness and Human Reason. And without further explanation or much further explanation of what this availability would look like, Schellenberg states that just by looking around with our eyes open, we can see that this state of affairs does not obtain. And I want to suggest that to determine whether adequate evidence has been provided, we need to better understand what it is to provide someone with evidence. Now, at first glance, this may seem like a really straightforward question. And in fact, given the way that this notion is used in the literature, one might really easily get the impression that we all have a pretty good idea what this looks like. But I think under scrutiny, it's not so straightforward. In The Wisdom to Doubt, Schellenberg identifies and describes various ways evidence might go unrecognized by us. And among these are the following categories. First is overlooked evidence. So sometimes evidence is missed even though it's accessible to us. This could happen if I'm distracted, I'm interrupted, maybe I just haven't directed my attention to the matter yet, and so I overlook some evidence. since non-resistant non-believers for Schellenberg are supposed to be individuals who have given sufficient attention to the evidence, this category is ruled out as a description of our evidential situation. So that is, Schellenberg rules out the idea that God has provided evidence, but we've overlooked it. Now, I just want to note that I think it's not at all obvious what it is or what constitutes giving sufficient attention to something. How easy does it need to be for us to take account or appreciate the evidence? I think there's some important questions here, and certain scenarios are not going to just fall neatly into some of these categories. So it's possible this category may have been too quickly dismissed. But since my concern for this talk lies elsewhere, I'm just going to note that and move on. Further categories Schellenberg delineates are as follows. Neglected evidence. This is evidence that's accessible, and the failure of recognition is my fault. So maybe I was lazy, or maybe I was involved in some sort of culpable self-deception. I should have been more attentive. Here the evidence is available, and I'm culpable for not taking it into account. And then there's inaccessible evidence, and this is evidence that has not been discovered. For example, maybe the evidence is in a cave somewhere, and we haven't found it yet. We would recognize it as evidence if we did find it. It's just it hasn't been discovered. So these options seem to me to fail to fully describe our evidential situation. And in particular, the evidential situation of the group that Schellenberg is most interested or most keen to discuss, that of former believers, I don't think falls into one of these categories. Former believers for Schellenberg display the most disturbing type of non-resistant non-belief. This is the non-belief of those who regret the loss of belief and wish to regain it but are unable to do so. He asks us to imagine individuals who, quote, start out assured of the power and presence of God in their lives, and then they lose all this, often by being exposed to reasons for doubt about the reliability of the support they have for theistic belief. This is also from Wisdom Today. So I'm going to suggest that we need another category here. I'm going to call it defeated evidence. So the problem is that it's often assumed that if the evidence is available and the agent is not in willful resistance, so if they have their eyes open, then the agent will believe that God exists. But I think on a plausible understanding of available evidence, this is not the case. So I think God could provide evidence which on its own is sufficient for belief that God exists, but one might also possess defeaters for that evidence, such that on their total evidence, agnosticism is rational. So I think the dichotomy of culpable resistance or not enough evidence is incorrect as a complete description of our evidential situation. I think it's much more complicated than this. So consider the following case where under normal circumstances, we might take the evidence provided as a paradigm example of providing someone with evidence. So suppose that I have a red cup, and I want you to know that I have a red cup. There's a number of different things that I could do to give you evidence that I have a red cup. I could tell you that I have a red cup. I could pull the cup out and set it on the table in front of us. Placing the cup on the table seems like a paradigm example of providing you with evidence. But consider this case where we introduce what is often called defeating evidence, and this will be familiar to many of you. So this is red lighting. So I have a cup and I place it on the table in front of you. You see it clearly. And then you're told by someone you trust, maybe Matt here, that the room is fixed with trick lighting. Lighting that makes objects that are not red appear to look red. So here we have the presence of evidence normally sufficient to make belief rational, plus the presence of misleading evidence. And as you all know, it's a common judgment among contemporary epistemologists, although there are some outliers here, that in cases like this, your belief that the cup is red is defeated, or your justification for the belief is defeated. Now, one point I want to draw attention to is that this situation is clearly different from a context where I don't do anything to give you any evidence that I have a red cup. I don't tell you, I don't bring it out and put it on the table. I think these two situations have some really important and relevant differences. But nevertheless, here's a few questions we might ask about this case. Have I provided you with sufficient evidence that the cup is red? Are you culpable for not believing that the cup is red? Are you in a position to rationally believe that the cup is red? Are you in the presence of evidence sufficient for belief? I think it's difficult to answer these questions when your evidential situation involves defeaters. It's not immediately obvious to me that you're not in a position to believe that the cup is red. It's not immediately obvious to me that I haven't provided you with sufficient evidence. I think we certainly can't determine this just by looking around with our eyes open. Okay? But I think it's also clear that the problem is not, in this situation, that your eyes are closed and you're resisting the evidence. And I think here, and here's where I want to make the connection to faith, I think that there's some interesting questions surrounding faith that would arise here. So suppose that I say to you, trust me, there is no trick lighting. Trust me, the cup is red. I think there's some interesting questions about whether when you have an opportunity to put your faith in me or to trust me on this point, whether or not that makes a difference to how we answer the question of whether or not I've provided you with evidence or whether or not you're in a position to believe. Okay, so I don't take these considerations to refute the hiddenness argument, but rather to call for clarification. And there's a few points I want to draw from this. First, I think we need a better understanding of the notion providing or making available evidence. And I think the literature is suffering as a result of a vague understanding of this locution. Second, we can't reason from non-culpable non-believers to the absence of adequate evidence for God's existence. At least, I don't think this inference is warranted without further argumentation. And third, as I mentioned, I think there's a significant difference between an evidential situation where one fails to have evidence, which on its own would make P probable, and an evidential situation where you do have evidence that makes P probable, but you also have defeaters. And I think that focusing on this latter situation makes something along the lines of a free will defense relevant here. So current explanations of the hiddenness problem place the blame either on God or on the non-believer. So either God has not provided us with adequate evidence, or someone is culpably resisting the evidence, and so we blame the non-believer. I think focusing on defeated evidence introduces a third option here. So it's not God's fault, it's not the non-believer's fault. In this case, it would be Matt's fault for, introducing the defeating evidence. So I think just as the free will of agents can contribute to an explanation for why God allows at least some kinds of evil in the world, the free will of agents could explain the introduction of certain defeaters and thus contribute to an explanation of the problem of divine hiddenness. Okay, so now I want to suggest a way that maybe we could fix the argument, given what I've said. There's a lot of ways to understand the claim that God is hidden. I think if we take hidden as synonymous with God has not provided adequate evidence, then the reasoning here shows that the existence of non-culpable non-believers is not enough to conclude that God is hidden. Now, a somewhat natural way to fix the argument is to suggest that despite the availability of evidence, there's still something inadequate about our evidential situation. So it's still impoverished in a way that a loving God would not permit. So I think we can ask again, what's wrong with our evidential situation? And one option is to argue that a loving God would provide us with adequate evidence, but also provide us with defeaters. Okay? And I think this initially seems to be like a plausible reply to what I've said so far. But note that this makes the argument more difficult to advance, because it makes what's required of God more demanding. It might be easy to get on board with the idea that God ought to provide adequate evidence when doing so seems somewhat minimal or easy. But once we introduce a requirement that God provide defeaters, this has the potential to raise the demand for evidence significantly. So one important question that arises is God required to defeat every defeater everyone has? Is he obligated to make everyone's total evidence favor God? Or perhaps make it favor God in a way that's obvious to that agent? And one worry here is that there'll be no limit to the amount of evidence that God must provide. So notice that it's not clear what minimally I can do in the red cup case to get you to believe that the cup is red once you trust someone that there's trick lighting in the room. Now, Schellenberg often uses language that makes it seem that he thinks a loving God would do whatever he can to ensure the belief of those seeking belief. So this suggests that maybe he would be open to this stronger requirement for more than mere adequate evidence. But at the same time, he maintains that he's not asking for very much. Nothing extreme, no compelling proofs or wondrous signs. So he states that, quote, reflection on the nature of love does not suggest reasons for God to provide us with some incontrovertible proof or overwhelm us with the display of divine glory. Rather, what a loving God has reason to do is provide us with evidence sufficient for belief. So it seems plausible to me that if providing sufficient evidence requires that God defeat all defeaters, this may result in something like a requirement for fireworks or something similarly overwhelming. Yet, advocates of the argument suggest that they have something less than this in mind when they ask for a stronger evidential position. So I think that there's at least some cost to advancing the argument this way, and some evidence that advocates of the argument would resist formulating it in this way, but they might be forced into it. Another issue concerns whether there is some amount or kind of evidence that God could provide that would defeat all defeaters and make belief that he exists rational, but do so without placing the agent in a position to know that he exists. So we might wonder whether we can avoid construing the central premise of the argument in this way. If there's a loving God, then each person will be in a position to know that he exists. I think the line of thought that I've been advancing leads the argument in this direction. And I also think that advocates of the argument would be unhappy with this construal. But for the sake of time, I'm going to move on. So just to wrap up this section before I talk about the higher order evidence argument, I think that regardless of whether God is obligated to provide us with defeaters, we might agree that it seems like a good idea. We might think it would be better if we had defeaters, better if we had a stronger evidential position. And so I think it still makes sense to look for an explanation for why our evidential situation is not stronger than it is. Of course, these reasons may not be forthcoming. Okay, so I'm just going to say a few things about this different version of the argument. I've been using a version that Schellenberg advances. I'm now going to talk about one that I call a higher order evidential argument, and I think there are hints of this in Schellenberg, but I think this needs further development. I also think this is a more promising way to think about divine hiddenness. Okay, so this way of thinking about hiddenness proceeds directly from the weakness of our evidence for theism to atheism. So here's a few claims that Schellenberg makes. He says, all I seek to show is that we might expect God's existence to be more obvious. The weakness of evidence for theism is itself evidence against it. Individuals who find the evidence inconclusive must ipso facto become atheists. The weakness of theistic evidence must in their case be viewed as itself a consideration that tips the balance in favor of atheism. So the idea here is this. The fact that some relevant body of evidence doesn't favor theism is itself evidence for atheism. Now, the presentation of this argument generally relies solely on this claim. We'd expect God to provide stronger evidence than we in fact have. I think that there are two ways in which one could agree with that claim, that we'd expect God to provide stronger evidence than we in fact have, without it turning into evidence for atheism. I'm going to say how. So first, suppose that we expected that God would give us better evidence. Suppose we expected he would make his existence obvious to everyone. But in fact, what we have is just adequate evidence for theism. In this case, our evidential situation is not evidence for atheism. It's just not what we expected. So consider this analogy. Suppose you're on your way to my house, and I expect that if you come to my house, you'll come through the front door. And then you arrive and you decide to come through the back door. When you come through the back door, I still get great evidence that you came to my house. It's just not the evidence that I expected to get. Okay? It's nevertheless very strong evidence. So our expectation of what the evidence would be like is in this way irrelevant to what we ought to believe. What's relevant is the evidence that we actually have. When the evidence we have is adequate to support belief, the fact that we expected stronger evidence does not mitigate this support. So I think if you're a theist and you think you have adequate evidence, you can still agree with Schellenberg's claim that maybe we would have expected it, our evidential situation, to be stronger. Maybe we would have expected it to look differently than it does. I think it's fine. That does not lead us straight into an argument for atheism. Okay, but suppose we grant both the assumption that the relevant body of evidence is counterbalanced and that we expected stronger evidence. In order to conclude that such an evidential situation is evidence for atheism, we also need to know something about the probability of counterbalanced evidence given atheism. And it's at least not obvious to me that we'd expect to have the evidence that we do have given atheism. I think it's plausible that it's more likely we'd have an evidential situation that favors atheism. And there's a large literature on this, which is mostly inconclusive, but if any of you have read it, I'd love to talk to you about it. In any case, the point I want to make is that discussion of this likelihood and the comparative likelihood has been overwhelmingly neglected in the literature. And too often, a jump is made from a loving God would have given us better evidence to the weak evidence we have is evidence for atheism. And this inference cannot be made without further argumentation. Okay, so I have one final concluding note. Just one. Okay, this is really good. It'll be worth it. Okay, so really, I'm on the last page. Okay, so one question in the literature concerns whether there's distinct work for the hiddenness argument to do, and some have thought that there isn't. And this group generally thinks that the problem of hiddenness is subsumed under the problem of evil, and so it's already been taken into account. Now, I think that the problem of hiddenness is distinct from the problem of evil, and I just want to make one suggestion for how we can appreciate the distinct contribution that it has the potential to make. So think of this analogy, and I call this horse race. So suppose I want to know who won a race, A or B. And two people tell me, I didn't see the race, two people tell me A won, two people tell me that B won. So I go 50-50. Then I'm thinking about it, and I realize, A is really a show-off. And if he won, it's really unlikely anyone would think that B won. he would have done maybe some like unforgettable victory dance, and it would be really clear to everybody that A won if in fact A had won. So it's very unlikely I would be in the evidential situation that I'm in fact in, where 2 people told me A won and 2 people told me B won, if A won. And I also realized that B is not at all like that. He's not a show-off, so it's not that surprising that if B won, it would be, kind of forgettable. I think if I reflect on this, then the evidential situation that I have can move me, can be evidence for B winning, and I can raise my credence that B won on that basis. So similarly, I think that if there is someone for whom the evidence for God's existence is counterbalanced, they reflect on the nature of God and they think it's unlikely God would put us in that evidential position. And they think that the evidence they in fact have is likely on atheism. Then their evidentially weak situation can be evidence for atheism. But in the absence of discussion in the literature on this last point, the probability of our evidential situation on atheism, I think it's premature to conclude that the hiddenness argument is a success. That's it.
So, Lindsay, if you can grab the
Oh, does she want
next
this?
to the projector, and make sure it's on. And we can turn this off so you're not getting blue rays on you. Yep, it's on.
Okay, so thank you, Charity. I think this is really interesting. Okay, so just brief summary before I get some comments here. Charity's thinking overall that there's this way of supporting the central argument for denying hiddenness, but fails to take into account something really important. And once we make this clarification, that we're going to see that the original argument isn't as persuasive as it originally was. So, to summarize, I think her clarification is a helpful one with respect to taking out defeaters. But I'd like to hear more overall about what difference that makes to the hiddenness dialectic, and in particular how that might help defenders of the existence of God against the argument. So I'll just briefly summarize the argument so you can recall that and we're on the same page with it, and then I'll offer 3 separate comments on her response to it. So the central argument has this premise 1, this conditional claim that if a loving God exists, then there are no non-culpable non-believers. And then Schellenberg and others argue for the second claim, premise 2, there are non-culpable non-believers, so we get that a loving God doesn't exist. So Charity thinks premise 1, the conditional premise, is supported by 2 claims. It's kind of like a hypothetical syllogism. So if God exists, then he does provide adequate evidence of his existence. And if he provides adequate evidence of his existence, then there are no non-culpable non-believers. So then we get, if a loving God exists, there would be no non-culpable non-believers. So she is arguing that once we incorporate the idea that sometimes we encounter defeat for the evidence that we have, that we're not actually going to be able to support that important conditional. So the upshot is that one way of supporting that crucial conditional in the central argument is going to not go through. It's problematic. So the action is kind of around this idea of what it means to provide adequate evidence. So Charity thinks that when we're determining what counts as adequate evidence, we have to recognize the existence of defeating evidence. So sometimes an individual does have adequate evidence for a proposition, but she might have other evidence that defeats that evidence, whether or not that is misleading or accurate. And then Charity offers a suggestion that it might be a really good way of explaining what's going on with individuals who formerly believed in God, or the proposition that God exists, but then later abandoned that belief. They received defeating evidence for their original evidence. So it strikes me that it's important to think about this category of defeated evidence when we're talking about hiddenness, because it offers us a really more nuanced way of thinking about what our evidential situation in fact is. But I'm not entirely clear on how much it advances the defense against that argument. So my first main comment is that to me it seems like if we account for defeaters when we're explaining our situation, it seems to just push back the problem, push back the original hiddenness problem. So the central argument requires those who defend God's existence to explain why God would not provide adequate evidence for his existence sufficient to ensure that there's not going to be any non-culpable non-believers. Or else they're going to have to explain why there are no non-culpable non-believers, that all non-believers are guilty, in other words. But even if defenders start thinking about defeaters and heeding their existence, it seems like they still have to offer this explanation. They still have to explain why wouldn't God provide adequate evidence of his existence to ensure that there are none of these non-culpable non-believers. It's just that when they give that explanation, they're going to have to specify not just why God didn't give enough original evidence, but why he doesn't provide evidence that defeats these defeating evidence. So why doesn't he give us defeat or defeaters? So let me kind of back up and say how I take the dialectic to go. Page 2 here. So we might think of adequate evidence in two ways. We might think that it includes giving this defeating, it includes defeating evidence, or we might think it excludes defeating evidence. And I think either way that we think about it, defenders of God's existence have a similar burden of explanation. So on the one hand, we might think adequate evidence includes defeating evidence. And if that's true, then it seems like God hasn't provided adequate evidence of his existence because there are some people who have defeaters and they don't end up believing that God exists, and they're not guilty for it, presumably. So defenders have to explain, why is this the case? This is the sort of problem. On the other hand, if adequate evidence excludes defeating evidence, then as Charity argues, it might well be that God has provided adequate evidence for his existence, but that some people have a defeater, and so they're not going to end up believing in God. But then the defenders of God's existence have to explain, why would God do that? Why wouldn't he just offer defeaters so that we get rid of these people who don't believe in him, given the high cost of not? So Charity does say it's not clear exactly what it would take to provide defeaters for everyone who has a defeater. But I think that's similar to the original situation. It's not exactly clear what it would take to provide adequate evidence of God's existence, even if we don't talk about defeaters. And yet, advocates of the hiddenness argument still maintain that since God is omniscient, presumably he can figure it out, and being omnipotent and loving, he would be able to, and he could, or he'd want to. Charity also says that in order to provide defeaters for every defeater that everyone has, it might be that hiddenness advocates are forced to maintain that God has to put everyone in a position to know that he exists rather than just rationally believe it, and perhaps they don't want to go that far. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about why. I'm not sure why they wouldn't want to go that far. If that's really what it takes for people to, for example, avoid eternal damnation, then presumably, again, a loving God would want to do it, omnipotent would be able to, and he'd know how. So to summarize sort of the first comment, which is the longest one, I agree that cases in which you have a defeater are clearly different from cases where you lack evidence to begin with. But I'd like to hear more about how incorporating defeaters gets God off the hook for not just providing defeaters. That's perfect. Okay, second super brief comment is that I'd like to hear more or some about culpable defeat. Because as long as everybody who has a defeater for God's existence is culpable for having that defeater, then we're still going to be able to make this inference that Charity wants to block, which is if there are non-culpable non-believers that exist, then we conclude God hasn't provided adequate evidence. So the validity of that inference is going to depend crucially on whether or not the non-believer is culpable for the defeater that she has, as well as whether or not she's culpable for failing to heed any defeaters that she might have. So that's second comment. And last comment is about the higher order argument and Charity's analogy. So this argument is that given our expectations, our evidence for God's existence is weak. So then actually it serves as evidence against God's existence. So Charity responds to this, and I think contrary to what she argues, that our expectations of the evidence actually do make a difference to what we ought to believe overall, in a way that it seems like she's suggesting that they're not. So I agree with her that our evidential expectations don't impact the evidential support relation between evidence we actually have and the proposition that God exists. But I do think they impact what we ought to believe overall, given our total evidential situation. So Charity gives this analogy of the friend coming over, In the analogy, you expect your friend's going to come over in the front door, actually comes in the back door, and it's still equally strong evidence if she comes in the back door, regardless of your expectations. So I think that's right. I agree with that case, but I'm not quite sure that's analogous to our situation with God. So here's another case I think might be more analogous. Assume that your friend comes over to your house every day at 2 p.m. on Thursdays, and when she arrives, she always knocks on the door with a signature knock. It's very distinctive. Pick your rhythm. So when you have her come over, you expect that her presence is going to be indicated by that special knock. So this Thursday, however, you hear the doorbell at 2 p.m. You don't hear the knock. So you think something like, okay, I haven't heard the special knock, so my friend isn't here yet. It's probably a salesperson, or maybe it's the mail person, something like that. So I think that seems a perfectly reasonable inference from your total evidential situation, even if we assume that it actually was your friend who rang the doorbell. She did come to your door and ring it, rather than knocking. I think what you ought to believe, given your total evidence, is impacted by this expectation that you have that's reasonable to have, that when your friend comes, it's always indicated by something that's, in this case, absent, this special knock. And I think your friend could hardly hold you culpable for failing to believe that she was at your house, given that she didn't give you the kind of evidence that it's reasonable to expect, given the kind of person she is, given your past experience with her. So I think this is similar to the situation with God. Given what we know about God's nature, it seems reasonable to expect that God would be the sort of person to indicate his presence by giving certain kinds of evidence, call it E. And what we ought to believe, given our total evidence, is going to be impacted by that expectation. But then, as the Hiddenness argument goes, it seems that that evidence E is absent. So then Hiddenness advocates argue that because of this, God could hardly hold a person culpable for not believing that he exists, given that he didn't provide the kind of evidence that it was reasonable to expect, given the kind of person that he is. So that seems like the kind of situation that's more analogous, which still seems like it's problematic that we have these expectations. Okay, so here's just a brief summary of the 3 comments. I'd like to hear a little more about how the category of defeated evidence affects the Hiddenness dialectic, in particular how it would help defenders against the argument to maintain that God still exists, because it seems like it pushes back the problem. And then second, I'd like to hear more about what counts as culpable defeat. Is it always, what sort of defeaters, I guess, do people have, and then such that they're not culpable for those defeaters? And then lastly, I'm not quite convinced that the reasonable expectations of evidence don't actually really impact what we ought to believe about God. Thanks.
Okay, thanks so much, Lindsay, for these comments. I'm going to try to be really quick, and I'll try to address all 3 of her points. So first, how does what I say in the first part of the paper help? I don't think, as I mentioned, that it refutes the argument. So I think that one thing it does is it calls for more clarification. And I think pursuing what it is to make evidence available will help elucidate what the argument is. But I also think that how we're thinking about it is really important, especially when we start thinking about the kinds of analogies that Schellenberg often uses to advance the argument. So sometimes he uses the analogy of a child, who's alone and lost and calling out to their parent and just gets silence. And I think even the language of hiddenness is very suggestive. And when you think about, me putting the red cup out in front of you, I think, I'm not hiding the cup from you. I'm not providing you with nothing the way that silence suggests. And so I just think, how we're thinking about the way this case, these kinds of cases go and what analogies we use are important. So I think one way that it could help is in that respect. So I do think it makes the argument more difficult to defend, even if it doesn't, get God off the hook, as you said. And then about culpable defeat. So I was thinking that people who have defeaters are not all culpable for their defeaters. I think if you think, evil in the world is in some way a defeater for God's existence. I'm not culpable for all the evil in the world or for believing that there is evil in the world. It could be that a child is raised by atheist parents and they trust the testimony of their parents when they say there's no God. And so I think that there could be lots of ways in which someone would not be culpable for the different fears that they have. But I think it would be interesting to pursue where that would lead. And then lastly, about the expectations. So I think that the analogy that I gave about your friend coming over, I didn't take that to be an analogy that's supposed to represent all individuals with respect to God's hiddenness. I do think that some people have adequate evidence for God's existence, and I think if you have adequate evidence, the point of that example was supposed to be that I don't think you need to resist agreeing with the claim. We might have expected that our evidential situation would be stronger. So I think it's fine for someone who believes in God to say, you know, before I opened my eyes and got any evidence about the world, I would have thought if there's a loving God, we would have had really superb, super duper evidence. This is what I expected. But what I got was good evidence. Okay? So I think what we need to be focusing on is not what we expected, but what is the evidence that we have. If the evidence is good and it makes God's existence, way more likely than his non-existence, then that's the way in which I think that the expectation of super evidence is irrelevant. But it's in that case. So I don't think it's always irrelevant. And the horse race case was supposed to be one example of how your expectations of what the evidence would look like would influence you. And I think that someone like Schellenberg might be in something more like that evidential situation. I just think not everybody's in the same evidential